So we're here on the edge of Superior National Forest. I'm with Aaron Kania. He is the District Ranger on the Canoe-country District. It's been a very busy time to start the paddling season, the boundary waters, and just around northeastern Minnesota in terms of fire activity. And it's been making news all over. I've been communicating with people on Superior National Forest and elsewhere as crews have come and gone. So we wanted to talk about fire and really narrow it down into the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness and talk about some of the lightning strike fires, Horse River most recently, and newsworthy in terms of like relevancy in the month of June here where we're at now, and talk about management of these fires, particularly when it's lightning strike, naturally caused fires, in other words. What's the approach of the Forest Service when there's a lightning strike, a fire that starts, a wildfire starts, but it's caused by a storm, a lightning strike? In general, what's the approach?
Yeah, Joe, I'm really glad you're over here asking tough questions like usual, but this is what's on people's mind. My phone rings and these are the exact things that people are asking me, so it's really nice to have these conversations. So yeah, to differentiate a lightning strike versus, like, say, even a fire outside of the wilderness that's next to a lot of houses and structures and hospitals and towns and roads and stuff like that. Very, very different thought process goes into it. But really the one thing that's first of mind is, what's the fire activity like? And we've definitely seen that in the last month. Mother's Day down at the Camp House fire, day one, it just up and ran and it was off to the races. And
that's
then
the national news fire outside the wilderness, south
yeah,
of here.
very big fire, a lot of homes involved and roads and people. So then the difference was, then there was a storm that came in and it really slowed the Camp House and the Jenkins Creek's fires down. A lot of moisture and clouds, and it calmed them down.
And snow,
and lightning.
Yeah, that's right.
And lightning. And when that lightning came in, we had a couple things. We had a lightning strike right off on Lake 3. It was on an island, and it was on an island in Lake 3 that had been burned in 2011 during the Basswood Creek fire.
So now we're back in the wilderness again when you're talking about
Yep, we're back in the
Lake 3.
wilderness on Lake 3. And so because that had burned, there was very little fuels. There was very little balsam out there. And so that fire, even though it just hit the tree, it just stayed right on that tree. And so that day, there was actually a paddler out there camping, saw the lightning strike and hit, and like called us immediately.
Interesting.
And we sent a crew out there. They got right on it, found it, and we're able to keep an eye on it and figure out where it's at, what the fuels are, and like what kind of a threat it is. Is this going to stand up and it's going to take off and run, or is it going to maybe just stay on that island and just kind of, what we call skunk around and just kind of move right around by that tree? And that's what that one chose to do. So that's where we get into looking at our policies, right? And one of the things here on the forest that's nearest and dearest to us is our forest plan. And our forest plan in the wilderness chapter talks about allowing fire to play its natural role. So taking that into account, but then also taking into account the risk. So if fire was playing its natural role in conditions like we had during the Camp House fire, well, that could move out of the wilderness and then threaten homes and resorts and entry points and roads. So, we're going to take strategic actions, or our firefighters are going to do certain things like get aircraft involved, put firefighters closer, protect homes, do that kind of work. So it's really hard in those circumstances because fire wants to move. It's thick. The forest is thick and a lot of fuel out there to burn. But in this case, just getting out there on that day and looking, and there's really no fire activity, and that one just self-extinguished. It just kind of burned that tree out and it was done.
Okay.
So we were able to watch that and say, okay, this, it's contained on the island. There's really no need for air tankers or chainsaws or pumps and hoses. So really protecting that wilderness character and those wilderness values that the Wilderness Act directs us to be thoughtful about.
And what about Horse River? I mean, it seems like it's been different because we've got information shared from Superior National Forest office about these elite crews that came
Yeah,
in, and,
yeah,
and
sure.
it seemed like a much different approach.
It
than what
is,
you're
and
describing.
yeah, similar but different. You know, we're really able to be flexible in making our decisions. So same lightning storm, right? The May 15th lightning storm that slowed down Jenkins and Camp House, and then started the one on Lake 3. Also started the fire out at Horse River. But because it was cloudy, cooler, there was more moisture, it took until May 22nd before that one actually put up smoke to where we could see it.
Wow.
So we saw it, first thing went out there and flew over it and looked at it and said, okay, where's this at? Where's this at in relation to the public? And then what kind of threat is the public under? Like people out there in the wilderness that are paddling and canoeing, and by now we're past Memorial Day and now we're getting into our busy season, so a lot more people out there.
Right.
And again, that fire activity, so it was remote, is like 3/4 of a mile or so from like a canoe route, and so there's plenty of room out there.
Near Basswood in that area?
Near Basswood, the Basswood River, the Horse River, it's a big travel route from Horse Lake to like upper and lower Basswood Falls.
Yeah.
A lot of people in that area normally, and a bunch of campsites. So, but when we flew over it, we looked and there's this really nice wet area, and it's a winter mushing route for the dog teams. And so there's a really nice, basically a fire line right there just to the west of it.
Okay.
And then just on the north side, there was another drainage there in between the fire and where the people are. So we had some features out there that were naturally just holding that fire to where it wanted to be.
Yep.
And not really threatening the public, but just extra sense of precaution and a safety measure. We sent wilderness crews out there that first day just to start informing people. We put a small closure into effect just to keep people out of the fire area. And then really assessing how can we safely get firefighters in there, because it's so remote that we need to get those firefighters in safely, but because the fire activity isn't growing and threatening, it's like, you know, we don't want to get our firefighters injured, like being aggressive and taking these actions that are going to get them hurt. Like operating chainsaws that far away from any medical services is really challenging.
And is it common that chainsaws are used in this type of?
Yeah, so that's a real consideration. So what happens when we use anything, any motorized equipment or any developments that we're thinking of, like say helispots to land a helicopter? That's something our firefighters are asking us as leaders in the agency for permission. And it's a pretty expedited process, but we're really asking them the why. And we ask, have you thought about other strategies? And so in this one, very early on, we were comfortable with where it was at. There wasn't a need for chainsaws. There wasn't a need for pumps. There was a need for a helispot. So that's something we thought about. And then there's ways to build helispots that don't have a long-term impairment to the wilderness. So really using those minimum tools and really thinking about alternatives. So thinking about some alternatives as this progressed, there was a consideration whether you need a pump to pump water and spray the fire, or actually bring in this big plastic container that has about 75 gallons of water called a blivet that uses gravity flow. And then that, we don't need a motor. And so we can use a non-motorized technique. So those are the kind of decisions.
But you did use motors on Horse River, right?
Well, helicopters, definitely a motor.
Yeah.
You know, and then a real minimal amount of chainsaw use.
Okay.
So our really limited the amount of motors. Obviously, again, very different than Camp House or Jenkins Creek, where it's like bulldozers and excavators and all sorts of motors.
Okay. I mean, because it seems like in most instances recently, like from John Eck fire to just the fires that have been in the wilderness in recent years, that there's usually a suppression tactic that is implemented. And it's not often that it's just sort of let to burn, like in Quetico. That's very much the approach, and that doesn't seem to be as happening as much here. Like who is it that's deciding that, and what are, I mean, I get these factors you're describing them about the conditions, and it's variable, but it just seems like the Forest Service is most oftentimes putting out fires in the wilderness.
Yeah, so I think maybe a couple ways to look at that. So each fire is unique, right? The fire conditions are obviously very unique, and we go through this process for each fire of, you know, what's its threat to values. And so the first thing we look at are values, right? Are they houses and structures? Are they people? And you know that helps to identify like what strategy we need to take to, you know, assess or react to the fire. This fire here, given its location and its minimal fire activity, you know, we could take that lower end of the scale, like get out there, take a look at it. But at the end of the day, on the Horse River fire, by the time we found it, assessed it, got people safely on site, they were able to look at those natural features. There was 15 days where that fire was burning and creeping, and it really self-extinguished itself, right? It put itself out. And so to me, that's a situation where we're doing the things we needed to do to keep the community safe, keep people safe, keep firefighters safe, while at the same time being really flexible to respond to any changes in that fire activity.
Yeah.
And work accordingly. We've had some on Horse Lake, or I'm sorry, on Four Town Lake, just a couple years ago in 2021, where it was a 20-acre fire lightning strike, and we ended up using the lakeshore and some wetlands, and that fire grew to 250 acres, but stayed within that footprint.
Yeah.
And that was extreme fire conditions, really droughty. So each fire is unique. Like, you know, we just gave the example of Lake 3,
Yeah.
that we're taking these, I guess, a real thoughtful approach. And this really gets into the real long history of fire in this ecosystem.
Right. I mean, that's kind of the underlying thing about this discussion and this. If there's a fire, how are you going to respond? Because the woods here need fire. It's like an
Yeah.
essential component of a healthy forest. I mean, even just here behind us, you can see like this is where we're at standing here. This is like managed timber and forest, and like if the viewer can see this line here, that's not.
Yeah.
And it's obviously a much different looking forest. Feels like a healthy forest. That feels like a thicket of chaos.
Yeah, and it's good that you bring that up, because underneath us too, they might not be able to see, is all the blueberries that are underneath here, right? And so historically, and we have really good data through our partnerships with the University of Minnesota. There's a group that have done a lot of research out there with dendrochronology, and they've actually gone out there. Lane Johnson,
yeah.
yep. And what they've done is they've actually found stumps that are really old, and they cut a cookie, and then they count the tree rings, and they can see how many times fire has been in the area.
They picked up on Heinzelman's work and
Heinzelman, yep. And so Heinzelman was looking at this. He was looking at aerial photos of the canopy, so he's looking at big fire, what we would call low frequency but high intensity fire. And what Lane Johnson and all those researchers were looking at is the understory. And so what they're seeing is high frequency but low intensity fire, right? And those two fire regimes work together to end up with a forest like this. And so it's really fascinating, because in their dendrochronology, you can see when this was a fur trader route that we were getting fires every 10 to 15 years pretty consistently throughout that whole time. And that's whether it be lightning, the Ojibwe burning for cultural purposes like blueberries, or even escape campfires from the fur traders, right? Maybe they didn't put their fire out every morning and it got away. What we don't want to happen today. And so those fire effects are still, they were on the ground. And then about 1916 is when the big timber logging came through, and that's the white pine, red pine, that was cut. And it really transitioned that forest into aspen and fir, like balsam fir. And then you just really don't see a lot of fire for about 100 years. We've excluded fire, whether through our suppression or excluding cultural burning. And so so you can see that on the land, and like you say, the result is this really thick forest behind us with you know, fir that's affected by spruce budworm, and the difference between where we're standing here. So this probably represents what it may have looked like 150 years ago, and then that back there looks like what some of it looks like today.
Yeah, a lot of the boundary waters looks like that. And so, I mean, when we get into like things, when you're mentioning like the history of fire and what's now the boundary waters, and with the tribes and the Forest Service signing the memorandum of understanding and recently, where is there engagement with the bands about
Yeah.
about even suppression and like, hey, we're going into Horse River fire? Is there consultation happening?
There really is, and even Jenkins and Camp House, you know, because this is the 1854 treaty area, and we recognize how sacred the right to hunt, fish, and gather is, medicines, food, moose, walleye, and so we heard a lot from the bands, and really right in the beginning gave them a call. We have those relationships already built with our MOU and our coordination calls and consultation calls. And so we have a sense of what the main values are that we're considering, but we wanted to check in if there's anything specific, you know, and what we heard is things like, you know, not that we use a lot of retardant in the wilderness because there's so much water, but you know, any retardant near walleye, you know, you don't want to have effects on walleye. You don't want to bring
PFAS type, like
well,
chemical
so
concern, or-
you know, retardants are, you know, they're not natural,
Yes.
right? And so it's somewhat of a fertilizer, and you know, can change, you know, the pH of the water.
Right.
You know, could have some effects on it.
Yeah.
So, you know, things like that. Any invasive species like spiny water flea, you know, like,
Yeah.
you know, we want to be really careful and really mindful of that. We do a lot of that in our normal firefighting, but we hear it as well with the bands. But then fire has a beneficial effect on treaty rights, creating moose habitat,
Right.
creating blueberries,
Yeah.
you know, kind of resetting and restoring fire to that landscape. And, you know, I'd say maybe, if you'll indulge me, a little story or maybe a metaphor is, you know, I try to think about this and explain it to folks. And I got some family down in southern Minnesota, extended family network, and Eden Prairie, like right on the edge of like where forests begin and the prairies end. And, you know, pioneered that land and came in, and it was really open, you know, and that openness, that prairie was really maintained by fire. You know, the Lakota would have prairie fires and kept that open. So you could say, you know, that when they came in and started plowing, like, you know, if I can use a metaphor of, they allowed the plow to play its natural role, right? They broke the soil and, you know, farmed, and life was good. And then over time, and, you know, a little bit during World War I, the family moved away, and the back 40 became established in trees, right? And it went about 100 years. There was no fire back there, no plowing, and the forest moved in, right? So then, not all that long ago, corn prices were high, and it's like, boy, we could really turn that back into corn. Well, you just can't allow the plow to play its natural role, because now you have a huge forest that's really thick back there. And,
Right.
and so, you know, that change over time, by removing that disturbance, by removing fire, you really change the land.
Yes.
And that's kind of what we're experiencing here. So in order to allow fire to play its natural role, we also have to acknowledge that the forest has changed. And the reason the forest has changed is because other things have happened, whether it's, you know, the initial timber harvesting or excluding fire over the last 100 years. So a lot of changed conditions. So we'd really have to ease into it so that we don't get that catastrophic fire, you know, when we do have a fire out there.
Okay, and that leads to my last thing I was hoping to talk to you about is just, it's June, it's starting to get busy, very busy in the boundary waters, and gonna get busier, and it's dry. It looks like it's gonna be a dry month. Campfire ban, is that something you're hearing discussed at meetings, or is on people's minds? You know, that practical, logistical thing for people to be thinking about, and then just in general about fire awareness and for people who are going camping.
Thank you so much for that question, because it's definitely on our mind. And
like, that's a possibility. You mean
well,
the
it's on our
ban?
mind because even just what we were talking about here of how different fire was back during Mother's Day versus how it was when the Lake 3 fire was discovered. You know, so that's very dynamic and changing. Just the other day, I was actually able to take a day off because we got a little bit of rain, and I was like, here's my chance to take a day off for once.
Yeah.
And so, just every day we're tracking what those weather conditions are, how they're shifting.
Yeah.
It's very different all across the state. And then a lot of coordination goes into play because it's counties, right? So across the boundary waters, we have 3 counties.
Right.
We have the state of Minnesota. We have the tribes.
Yep.
And then all of the different property owners and how it could affect them. So right now, we're looking at the weather forecast this weekend, another chance of rain. And what we learned through experience is it takes a couple days to get the message out that fire restrictions are in place. And sometimes if about the time you get the message out, it rains.
Yeah.
And then everybody's cold and huddled up and they want a fire. And then
Yep.
they're complaining why we have a fire restriction in. And then it dries up. And then if we take it off and put it on and take it off, we get a lot of feedback.
Right.
And so back in 2021 was a good example where it was a really long-term trend. We were seeing fires start from campfires or shore lunches. I think that's a good message. There's a difference between a shore lunch and a fire in a fire grate. And, you know, so once we see that longer term trend, that's usually when we start implementing fire restrictions that are more longer duration. There's a lot of other considerations that people don't always think about. So it has impacts on our timber industry. It has impacts on our railroads and some of our mining activity, because those can also be impacted by fire restrictions.
Okay. So no current plan for a campfire ban, but it's an option. It's something that we would be sharing publicly, of course, but not right now. But just so with that in mind, for people who are going in and having a fire, dry in June, getting busy, what should they be thinking about?
So what they should be thinking about is before they even go, right? Know before you go. One of those leave no trace principles. So have a backup plan. So have a stove, have something else, so that if it's dry, make that decision on their own. Like, you don't have to wait for the government to make that decision for you, right?
Cool.
Like, if you're not feeling comfortable, if it's too dry, have that backup plan. You know, when they pick up their permit, check in with their outfitter, check in with the Forest Service offices, look at our website, see if there's any fire restrictions in effect. And then once they get out there, if they do choose to have a campfire, you know, making sure it's in a fire grate in the boundary waters, and then don't leave that unattended. And you know the lure of it, right? You get to camp, you had a long day paddling, you have dinner, you get a fire going, and then that lake is just perfectly calm and it's calling your name and the fish are biting and you're like, I'm gonna go fishing, and then the fire's going. You cannot leave that fire unattended, because while you're out fishing, it could get away from you. Same thing in the morning, you know, well, before you go to bed, make sure it's cold and out before you go to bed. Drown it, like bring a bucket with you, have some way to drown that fire in the fire grate. And then in the morning before you leave camp, again, drown that fire.
Yeah, great. Simple reminders, helpful reminders for people who are headed to the wilderness, and also, you know, the opportunity to still enjoy a camping trip in the boundary waters without a fire, as many people are doing right now. Some people I know over on the Gunflint district, as a matter of fact, just came out and said, you know, they're out with kids and we chose not to have a fire, and you know, the bugs were getting pretty bad anyway, as we're experiencing standing here today.
Yeah,
and,
there you go.
And so they were just like, yeah, we tucked to bed early, and it was still a great trip. We got up a little earlier, and it's all good. So you don't have to have a fire if you're headed out. But really helpful information for people to keep in mind, and interesting to learn a little bit more about the approach from the Forest Service as they're thinking about how to manage these fires that crop up in the wilderness, especially lightning strike fires. And hopefully, Aaron, we don't have to talk again this year, because that would mean that there's not much fire activity happening. But if there is, you know, I really appreciate that we're able to communicate this way and come over to the Ely side and have these conversations here. So thanks so much for talking with Aaron Kania, the District Ranger here on the Canoe-Country District of Superior National Forest. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you, Joe.